Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning to you all. As was mentioned, I'm looking forward to speaking to you about how the digital revolution is reshaping the economy. I believe this is the most important challenge facing governments today. We've already seen tremendous disruption, especially over the past decade, but in the next decade, digital technologies will advance even faster, and there's going to be even more disruption in work and employment, in the distribution of income, and in the way that governments interact with their citizens. So today I want to share with you some of the research that we've been doing at MIT, especially at the MIT Sloan School and my own research center, which is called the Initiative on the Digital Economy. And the work we do is we draw on the research that we're doing in our laboratories and in our offices, but we also learned that the best way to really understand what's happening with these technologies and with the societies and the businesses is not simply to go to our offices and close the doors and windows and try to think deep thoughts about what's happening, but instead to go out and visit many companies. So I'm going to show you examples from people in Silicon Valley, in Europe. I'm delighted to be here in Dubai. I've visited many of the installations in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere to learn a little bit about some of the changes that are happening as technology evolves to change the way work is being done, in particular, the way it automates a lot of tasks that previously could only be done by humans. So let me start by asking a question. How many people here, because we're going to do this a little bit interactively, I have some questions, and at the end of this discussion, I'm going to also have some time for questions and answers, so feel free to think of questions you might want to discuss with me. But let me just start here. How many people here, anybody would like to have the power to be able to truly change the world, to transform the world? Just raise your hand if you'd like to have a few people here, just a few, okay, several people. So what would it take to change the world? What do you need to be able to change the world? Well, there have been different discussions. Margaret Mead said that it requires a small group of highly committed people. Steve Jobs talked about an insanely great vision. But I'm from MIT, and I'm going to take a little bit more of an engineering perspective on what it takes to change the world. I'm going to argue that changing the world takes two things: a power system and a control system. Now, a power system is needed because the world is mostly made of atoms, and they're held in place by strong physical forces, electromagnetism and nuclear forces. And to change the world, to literally change the world, to change things, you need physical power to be able to move those atoms around. So that's one of the things you need, is a power system to move and transform things. But you also need a control system. A control system tells you where, how to arrange things. And that's the mental power to arrange things. You need both the muscle power to physically move things and the mental power to organize things. Now, for most of human history, for centuries, millennia, both the power system and the control system was provided by humans. But then, in the early 1800s and the late 1700s, we had a transformation, the Industrial Revolution. And the thing about the Industrial Revolution was that it provided a new power system. In particular, James Watt improved the steam engine, a much better steam engine, and this gave us much more physical power. And subsequent inventions like the internal combustion engine, electricity, they all gave us more and more physical power. What was the result? Well, the main result was that our living standards soared. Today, people in Dubai or Boston or London or Tokyo are about 50 times wealthier than they were back in the 1800s. Vastly more wealth, more ability to change the world than we had before. And this is directly attributable to these new technologies. So for millennia, stagnant living standards, then a takeoff as technologies gave us more power to arrange the world. And of course, we continue to develop new power systems, but there's a second thing happening now, And this is what Andrew McAfee and I call the second machine age. And that is the new technologies don't simply give us more muscle power, they are also augmenting our brains. They're giving us more mental power. Things like computers and software, you've heard of big data, machine intelligence, they are allowing machines to make decisions, machines to do mental calculations, not just physical work. And of course, it's still in the early days of this. We've only been doing it for a couple of decades, but over time, this will become much more powerful as well. And I believe that the second machine age, the machine age that gives machines the mental power to work as a control system, in addition to the physical power to be the power system, is going to be even more important than the Industrial Revolution. It's going to have an even bigger impact on all of our living standards. And it's going to make us, as a society, wealthy beyond our belief. However, it's not exactly identical to the first machine age. There are also some important differences. One difference is that the second machine age is unfolding much faster than the first machine age. In the first machine age, if you look at some of the main technologies like the steam engine, they improved, but at a fairly slow rate. We did some measures in my book, The Second Machine Age, the book, and we found that the steam engine doubled in efficiency about once every 75 years. After 150 years, it was 4 times as powerful. So it was improving, but at a slow rate. In contrast, computers improve much, much more rapidly. Most of you have probably heard of Moore's Law. Moore's Law is the principle that computer chips double in power about once every 18 months, 10 times greater in 5 years, 100 times greater in 10 years, a much, much faster rate of change than the earlier technologies. A second difference is that these technologies work with digital information. So instead of atoms, they are now digitizing the world. And later in my talk, I'm going to talk about many of the special properties of digital goods. Digital goods are very different than goods made out of atoms, and they have unique economic properties. And this leads to very strange, weird, and often wonderful economics. And I'm going to discuss that in much more detail later. The third difference is that these technologies, it's not clear how they will interact with human labor. When we built the steam engine and made locomotives, we still needed a human to drive that locomotive. We still needed a human to drive the car. We still needed a human to organize the factory that was laid out. So the power system was complementary to human labor. As the power system became more and more successful, human labor became more and more valuable. As an economist, you see that in the way that wages went up. Wages every year went up steadily by about 2% per year. So by the end of the 20th century, wages were many times higher than they were in the 1800s. But in the second machine age, it's not so clear whether these new technologies are going to be complements that increase the value of human labor or substitutes that replace human labor and make human labor less valuable and less necessary. Depending on how that turns out, it's going to have very important implications for the distribution of income and the living standards of ordinary workers. So we're going to discuss that a little bit as well. Let me just first tell you a little bit about the technology. The next few slides, I want to describe what I mean by these new technologies. You've heard of computers and software, but I want to be more specific. Let me first go back just about 10 years, back in the year 2004, when I was teaching a course to a group of people, a little bit like this group here, but a course at MIT. And one of the things we were doing was we were discussing what the things that humans could do well and what the things that machines could do well. And the group, we came up with a list of 3 main categories that were uniquely human. One was mobility, autonomous mobility, just being able to walk around as I am here on the stage, or as you do when you walk up and down the stairs, or being able to pick things up, hold things, fine motor control. These are things that machines cannot do very easily, but humans, even a 2 or 3-year-old child can do these things. A second category is language and complex communication. Speaking as I am now, understanding. We have the translator over here who's translating in real time. This is not something that machines have historically been able to do very well. Writing text, writing stories. And the third category is pattern matching, solving problems, not just structured problems like arithmetic or multiplying numbers, but unstructured problems like answering queries in a call center or in a game show. These three categories were uniquely human, and back in 2004, there was a wonderful book written about what machines could do and what humans could do. And one of the examples they gave in that book, which I used in my course, was driving a car or a truck through heavy traffic. There's so much information coming in, visual, auditory, it's all unstructured, and as a result, we thought it was difficult or even impossible to write a step-by-step computer program that would tell a car how to drive down the highway. I see some of you are smiling because, of course, you know I was wrong back in 2004. Even though I didn't think it was going to happen anytime soon, 10 years later, there were self-driving cars. In fact, here's a picture of me and my co-author, Andy. We are kind of grinning like idiots because we are so happy that we just survived a ride on Route 101 in California in that self-driving car that's behind us. And this car drove all the way from Google headquarters in Mountain View up to San Francisco and back down again. And this was back in 2012, and there was no human driver driving it on the highway the whole time. So in 8 short years, between 2004 and 2012, the technology advanced so rapidly that we were able to have self-driving cars. And today, many of the automakers, Daimler-Benz, Nissan, Tesla, are making self-driving cars that they're testing on the highways. And within 5 years, I think most of us will be routinely driving cars like that on the highway, much more rapidly than we expected. So that's one area where technology has advanced even faster than I expected, and I'm the one who's trying to keep up with it. But there are many other areas as well. For instance, if you look at the 3 categories, all 3 of them have changed. All 3 of those things that I said were uniquely human, that's becoming less and less true. Now machines are beginning to do each of these things. For instance, this is the robot called Baxter. My friend, my colleague at MIT, Rod Brooks, has started a company called Rethink Robotics, which builds Baxter and similar robots, and they do simple tasks. For instance, here on this assembly line, they're taking little objects off of out of a box and putting them on a conveyor belt as it goes by. This is a fairly simple job, but it's something that millions of humans do in factories in Massachusetts, in China, in all over Asia, Africa, Europe, South America. People are doing this job, and now the robot can do it in similar jobs. This robot does not have to be programmed. Instead, the way you teach the robot is you hold its arm and you say, here, grab this and then move it over and put it here. And after you show it a few times, the robot understands what it's supposed to do, and then it does it by itself, and it keeps going. And it can recognize the objects, it can see them, it can touch them. And the robot costs only a little bit more than $20,000 US. And if you average it out over its useful lifespan, it's less than $4 per hour to do that job, because it can work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It doesn't need to stop for food or rest, or just keeps working. And every time they make a new version of the software, it gets faster and cheaper at the rate of Moore's Law. So this robot is getting better and better, and workers who previously did the job for $10 an hour or $8 an hour now have to compete with a robot who can do it at $4 an hour, $3 an hour, $2 an hour. There are other robots, some that look a little scary. Here's MIT. It used to be that the most frightening thing at MIT was having to take final exams, like people did last month in January. Now you have to be careful you don't run into one of these running around on the grass there at MIT. This is a robot from Boston Dynamics called Wildcat. This robot can run faster than a human being can. So it can outrun you. Don't try to run away from it. And other robots, here's another one at MIT called Atlas. This one looks more humanoid. It's about 2 meters tall. And Atlas is the latest robot that's taking on what's called the DARPA Robotics Challenge. 10 years ago, there was a DARPA challenge to build a self-driving car, and that was successful in making those self-driving cars. The new DARPA Robotics Challenge is to make a robot like this one, and what does this robot do? Well, one of the things it can do is it can walk and get into a vehicle, sit down, grab the steering wheel, put its foot on the pedal, and drive the vehicle a short distance. It can also get out. It can walk across a field of broken rocks or blocks. It can pick up a hose and a nozzle from the ground and attach the nozzle to the hose. It can walk to a door and open the door and go through the door. It can go up a set of stairs, simple stairs. A whole set of simple tasks like that is what the DARPA Robotics Challenge is meant to do. Now, many of these tasks it doesn't do very well yet. It's still fairly clumsy. It's still fairly slow. It's not perfect. But if you talk to Gil Pratt, who is the head of DARPA at MIT, in the US government, he says that the teams that are working on the DARPA Robotics Challenge are way ahead of where he expected them to be. So these robots are rapidly becoming much, much more successful. There's one team at MIT. There are teams at Carnegie Mellon. There are teams all over the world. I think the leading team is actually a team from Japan right now. Now think about it as a manager or a businessman or a government official. If a robot can do all those things that I just told you about, you could imagine putting them together to do tasks in a warehouse or a factory or a retail store. It wouldn't be that hard to put some of these steps together, and now you can do many of the tasks that not just millions, but hundreds of millions or billions of humans are currently doing in their jobs. Atlas and robots like it are becoming more and more capable. Now that's just the first category. The second category I talked about was language and voice recognition. Many of us have smartphones, and today if you see somebody talking to their smartphone, you don't really know, are they talking to somebody else, another human? Or maybe they're actually talking to the phone and telling the phone what to do. Maybe they're telling Siri that they want to know what the weather's going to be tomorrow. Well, I guess in Abu Dhabi, the weather's always the same, or in Dubai, it's always the same, so you don't have to worry so much. But in Boston, the weather's always changing. Or you want to see what movie or a near restaurant. Siri can understand what you're saying and carry out your instructions. We are in the middle of about a 10-year period where we went from machines could not understand when you spoke to machines will always, always be able to understand what you say. Right now we're in the middle. The machine is not perfect. Sometimes it's clumsy and you can't quite understand it, but within a few more years it will get better and better. This is a very unique period in human history when we are able to start talking to our machines and expect them to really understand what we're saying and carry out our instructions. There are also machines that are beginning to do translation, and I don't want to frighten the translator in the booth there, but there are some machines that are beginning to learn how to translate in real time. For instance, Microsoft has their new version of Skype. Many of you probably use Skype for video conferencing. And in the latest version of Skype, if you speak in one language, it can translate in another language. Not as well as humans, but well enough to do basic understanding from English to German, or from Chinese to French, or many other combinations of languages. And the third thing that they're beginning to do is to write stories, not just understand or translate, but actually to write stories. Here's a sports story about my home team, Boston Red Sox, when they won a baseball game. And if you read about it, it's nothing that interesting about the different players and what happened in the baseball game. I think the most interesting part of this story, if you look very carefully, is the byline. Who is it written by? Somebody with the name Automated Insights. That's a strange name for a human. That's the name of a machine. The machine wrote this story. In fact, Automated Insights, I just heard from the CEO yesterday, has a new contract with Associated Press, and they are writing thousands and thousands of sports stories and news stories and business stories about professional sports, college sports. There's a competitor called Narrative Science. They're writing stories about earnings reports, how much money Apple made. So these simple stories are being written by machines, by robots. And the third and most important category is that machines are beginning to solve problems. They can figure out the answers to complicated questions. And my favorite example is the game show Jeopardy. It's a simple question answering game show. Just curious, how many people have ever heard of the game show Jeopardy? Anybody heard of it? Yeah. So you guys are mostly familiar with it. It's a game where they ask questions about literature or science or sports or culture or history or geography. They can ask a question about almost anything, and the players try to answer it. And a few years ago, IBM developed a team that was trying to make a machine be able to answer these questions. And the head of that team was a guy named David Ferrucci. David Ferrucci spoke to my class at MIT, and he showed me a remarkable chart. He showed me this chart here, and I want to share it with you because it's astonishing. On one axis is how many questions they tried to answer, and on the vertical axis is how accurate they were. And all those little blue dots there, they look like kind of mosquitoes up near the top of the screen. Those are all of the human champions that ever played the game of Jeopardy on television. And as you can see, most of them are pretty good. They answer 70, 80, 90, even 100% of the questions correctly in any game of Jeopardy. And many of them are quite aggressive, too, trying to answer 50% or 60, 70, 80% of the questions. That's the humans. Now, he made this program, this engine called Watson. And when he first made Watson, it wasn't very good. Back in 2006, Watson got only about 20 or 30% of the questions correct. And you see Watson is a line instead of a dot because he has a little dial on Watson. He can say, Watson, be very aggressive, try to answer everything, or be more conservative, only answer the questions that you're very confident of. So Watson could answer anywhere along that line there. But Watson had one capability that none of the humans had, one very different capability. Watson could learn incredibly rapidly. They told Watson, why don't you go read Wikipedia? Go read all of Wikipedia and learn everything that's in Wikipedia. So Watson learned Wikipedia. And they fed more and more information into it about what all the longest rivers are in the world, who the top pop stars are, what the names of all the elements are, all the basic knowledge of humanity they were feeding in. And every few months, they came out with a new version of Watson. And Watson got better and better and better and better at a remarkably fast rate. And when he showed this chart to me in class 4 years ago, Watson was already better than most human Jeopardy champions. And a few months later, he decided to challenge the world champion of Jeopardy, a guy named Ken Jennings, to a game. And the television show Jeopardy said, yes, let's do it. We're going to do it on television. And in fact, Watson did much better than Ken Jennings, who's over there on the left, and Brad Rutter, who was the second best player in the world. And Watson got more money than both of them put together by answering these questions. And so Watson was able to read and understand the questions and then answer them very, very accurately. But of course, the purpose of Watson was not simply to win $77,000 on a television show. The real purpose of Watson was to be able to use this system to answer all sorts of different kinds of questions and to do many kinds of jobs. So Watson is now being used in call centers. In South Africa, there is a call center where people call in with questions, and the answers are provided not by human operators, but by Watson. There's a version of Watson that works in legal systems that helps provide legal advice for lawyers. There's another version of Watson that does investment and banking advice. Perhaps the most interesting applications of Watson are in the medical field. Watson is helping diagnose medical diseases, and doctors are consulting with Watson. I don't think Watson is today the best diagnostician in the world, but in 5 years, I think it may be. And when you go to get a medical diagnosis, you may well ask Watson for a second opinion after the doctor tells you the advice. Or maybe you'll go to Watson first and ask a first opinion from Watson. So all of these jobs are being affected by these powerful tools that are able to answer many kinds of questions in many kinds of domains. So what does this all mean for the economy? I could go more and give you more examples of amazing technologies. We describe many of them in the book, but I'm an economist and I want to think, what does this mean for jobs, for employment? What does it mean for government policy? What should our strategies be? Well, one of the things is that it's creating tremendous wealth. It's allowing us to do new things we never could before. For instance, how many people in this room right now have some kind of a device that when they are driving, it will give them directions, turn-by-turn driving directions to tell them when to turn left or right. Anybody have such a device? Anybody? Most people have a GPS device. How many people had a device like that 10 years ago? 10 years ago, how many people had a device that gave them turn-by-turn directions? I think just three or four people here. So many more people have that now than before. How is it possible that so many more people have it now? Well, of course, it's because most of us have it built into our smartphone. 10 years ago, it would have cost hundreds or thousands of dollars, and only in the most expensive cars. Today, it's free. It doesn't cost anything. If you have Google or Apple or Waze, it will automatically be included to give you turn-by-turn directions. This is one example of something that used to be very expensive or even impossible to purchase that's now widely available. It's what Andy McAfee and I call the bounty, the fact that we now have new goods and services that were never available before. And a good example of that is the kinds of things you can get in your cell phones today. For instance, this ad on the left from Radio Shack, that is an advertisement from 1995. And somebody pointed out to me that almost every object in there that used to cost hundreds or thousands of dollars, the telephone answering machine, the music player, the video player, the computer, the camera, the video camera, everything that's in there, almost everything, is now available on your cell phone for free. So that has been a tremendous amount of progress. Instead of buying those things, you just get them bundled in with your phone. And even some new things that never existed. I mentioned the GPS, the turn-by-turn driving directions, also cancer detectors, all sorts of other interesting capabilities. This means that we're becoming much wealthier. We now have goods and services that we couldn't have previously. In fact, working with a postdoc at MIT, her name is Joo-hee Oh, we worked and we calculated what is the value of these free goods that are available on the internet. Not all the free goods in the economy, but just the ones that are on the internet. And it worked out to be about $300 billion per year in the United States. So this is a tremendous amount of free stuff. What's interesting, though, for those of you who are economists, is that all of this value does not show up in our GDP statistics. It's true value, it's making us better off, but it doesn't show up in GDP. Why not? Well, because GDP measures the value of all the goods and services that are bought and sold. How much do you pay for Wikipedia? Zero. How much do you pay for the free GPS? Zero. All those things that you get for free, they add exactly 0 to GDP. So although we are getting wealthier in terms of what we can have as goods and services, our official statistics, our GDP statistics, are not capturing this value. And there's a growing gap between what we have and what the government statistics say. And this is something that we need to fix. We need to think about how to reinvent the government statistics, the GDP, also the productivity statistics that are based on GDP. They are all increasingly flawed and missing more and more of the real value. As our economy becomes more digitized, the gap between the value that we get as consumers and the value that's recorded in the government statistics is becoming much larger. And one of the projects we're working on at MIT is ways of reinventing those statistics to be more accurate. Now that's the good news, the bounty, the wealth that we're getting, but there's more to it as well. If you look at these trends in terms of GDP, productivity, employment, median income, these are some of the main things that economists like me track. And in the United States and other countries, they all kind of grew together, not just going back to 1950, but even back to 1900 and 1800. But recently, they've become decoupled. It's what Andy McAfee and I call the Great Decoupling. And what you see is that productivity and GDP have continued to grow, the blue and the gray line. However, employment and median income have stagnated or even begun to fall a little bit. And this separation is a new phenomenon. This did not happen previously. And in a way, it's a change or even a violation of the social contract that we used to have, that we would have a rising tide that made everyone wealthier. But now we see that many people, the median person, is now not as wealthy. So how can this be? What's going on? Why is it that we continue to create wealth, but now it's not being shared as broadly? And that stems from a fundamental economic insight, one that many of us are not used to understanding, but it's very important, and we write about it in our book. And that is that, yes, digital progress does make the economic pie bigger. It is creating more wealth, as I said, but there is simply no economic law that says that everyone's going to benefit evenly. It's possible for some people to be made worse off as technology progresses, and other people to be made better off. Now, that's not what happened previously, but it's beginning to happen now. In fact, economic theory says it's possible for a majority of people to be made worse off. It's possible for the median person at the 50th percentile to be made worse off, even if the overall pie is getting bigger. And this is a fundamental change from what happened in the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century. And this is one of the challenges that governments are going to have to face going forward, is how we deal with technologies that have these very different effects. Now, why is this happening? Well, it happens because technology can be biased. It's what economists call biased technical change. There's at least 3 ways that technology can be biased. I'm going to talk about each of them. The first one is skill-biased technical change, where technology affects one group of workers differently than another group. A second category is capital-biased technical change, where technology affects capital different than labor. And a third group is talent or superstar-biased technical change, where it helps a very small group of superstars. So the first one is this skill-biased technical change, and there are many articles written in economics about skill-biased technical change. I've written some of them, and many other people have. And you can see it by this chart. This is a chart that my colleague David Otter and Daron Acemoglu made, and it shows what happened to the wages of American male workers, but it would be very similar if I showed you female workers or if I showed you workers in other countries. The pattern is very similar. And what you see is that at first, in the 1960s and early 70s, everyone's wages went up. Whether you were a high school dropout or whether you had graduate school, your wages were increasing. Then in the 70s, there was a shock that everyone's wages went down for a little while. But since then, college and graduate wages have gone up again, but the high school wages have continued to fall, and so have people with even some college. So there's been this spreading out. The people with more education have done better. The people with less education are not even keeping pace. They're actually falling worse and worse than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. There are many causes for this. Part of it has to do with globalization, part of it has to do with tax policy and other things, but economists agree that the number one reason that this is happening is because of changes in technology. Technology is automating many of the routine tasks, the simple tasks that high school dropouts do, especially the routine, repetitive tasks in factories and warehouses, clerk jobs, some of the retail sales jobs. Many of those have been eliminated by technology, and the people who used to do them are seeing their wages fall. But at the same time, technology is augmenting the value of graduate school. The second category is capital versus labor. And here again, if you look at the United States data, it's very striking. For many years, the blue and the red line bounced around, the share that went to capital in profit and the share that went to labor in wages. But starting around 2000 or so, there's been a big divergence. And the share going to labor has been falling quite substantially because wages are falling and because fewer people are working. And the share going to capital in the form of profits are at record highs. And Thomas Piketty and others have written about this. And the third set is what we call superstar bias technical change. People who have extraordinary talent or luck are able to now use technology to reach a global audience. Lady Gaga can sing instead of just to a small concert hall, she can sing to 1 million or even 1 billion people. The Korean rock star Psy made a music video that quickly reached 1 billion people. So technology makes that possible, and that means that these superstars can make superstar incomes, become very rich. And it's not just in entertainment and music and movies, it's also in things like software. You may not recognize this guy, he's Scott Cook. The reason he's up here is because he helped develop TurboTax. It was a piece of software that helps people do their taxes. And TurboTax helped make Scott Cook a billionaire. He is now worth over $1 billion because this software is now used by hundreds of millions of people. And so you can not only replicate music, you can also replicate basic steps of a task. Think of tax preparation. Tax preparation is a series of steps to fill out the taxes. You can take that process and codify it. And once you codify it, that is to put it into rules, you can digitize it. In other words, make it something that software can use. You codify it and then you digitize it. And once you've digitized it, what can you do? Well, then you can replicate it. You can make copies of it. You can make a second copy. You can make 10 copies. You can make 100 million copies. And each of these copies has 3 interesting characteristics. Each copy can be made for almost 0 cost. Each copy is a perfect replica of the original. It's exactly identical. And each copy can be transmitted anywhere in the country or anywhere in the whole planet almost instantaneously. Digital goods are very different. Digital goods are free, perfect, and instant. Free, perfect, and instant. Those were not adjectives we used to describe goods and services previously, but they are standard descriptions of digital goods. And more of the world is becoming digitized. Every industry is becoming affected by these digital economics, and it's leading to superstars like the ones that we just showed you with Scott Cook or Lady Gaga or many others who have enormously high incomes. Which industries are being digitized? Well, there's several waves of them. The first wave of digitization was in software and the internet, media, telecommunications, industries that are inherently information-based. The next wave was in retailing, like Amazon, you see wholesaling, also finance, transactional industries. The third wave we're just in the middle of now, in manufacturing and logistics, the military, parts of agriculture, moving physical things around, they still benefit from some of these powerful technologies. The fourth wave hasn't really begun yet, but it's just the early stages. I mentioned some of the areas in medicine and law, in education, in government. That's also being affected. Now, government, I have to say, parts of government are in the first, second, and third wave as well. Parts of it is very transactional, but we're seeing some of that happen as well. And the fourth wave, I can see in the future, but hasn't really begun yet, and that's with domestic help, household help, child care, elder care. Eventually, the robots, like Atlas, but better versions of it, you'll start seeing used. And there's a company I'm advising, for instance, that has done some significant work in that area. Each of these waves is building on the previous one and is affecting more and more people, but you can see that they are coming, and it's clear with what's already happening in the laboratories at MIT and Silicon Valley and elsewhere that almost every industry will be affected. And of course, this has profound implications for government policy as these industries become more and more digitized and more automated. One of the things we're seeing is that the superstar economics that you saw in entertainment and in software are beginning to come to every other industry. And one reflection of that is what's happening to income distribution. There's been some talk about the 1% and how much wealth the 1% has versus the rest. I was in Davos, the World Economic Forum, 2 weeks ago, and everyone was talking about the 1% having more wealth. Well, it turns out that the 1% have their own 1%. This is the 1% of the 1%, the 0.01%. And we see that they also are getting a bigger and bigger share of the economy. In fact, according to Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, by many measures, the income share going to the 1% of the 1%, the 0.01%, is at a record high. It has never been higher. There was some early in the century fairly high, but then today is even higher. So this is, again, a function of many things, but one of the reasons this is happening is because of these superstar economics. When things are free, perfect, and instant, then you don't need to have lots of workers doing the job. You can just have one person develop a piece of software and then replicate it. Now, what does this mean for inequality? What does it mean for growth? Well, there's a number of things. It could lead to unemployment. You could have the wages fall, and ultimately that would lead to people not being able to get work anymore. And we see that the pace of change is going much more quickly. In fact, a child's PlayStation today is more powerful than a military supercomputer from 15 years ago. So there's just a tremendous improvement in the underlying technology. Let me skip ahead here. So what should we do? And then I want to get a little bit of time for some questions from each of you. Well, one way to think about when the second machine age really began, you could go back to when Garry Kasparov, the grandmaster, the world chess champion, played a game of chess against Deep Blue, a machine, back in 1997. And Garry Kasparov lost that day. The machine won. And today, the computers have continued to improve so much that if you have a chess program on an ordinary cell phone, a mobile phone, that chess program could beat a human grandmaster. In fact, Jan Donner, the Dutch grandmaster, was asked a few years ago, what strategy would you use if you had to play against a computer chess program? And Jan Donner looked troubled, and then he thought for a moment, and then he smiled. He said, "Oh, I know what I would do. I would bring a hammer." So this is a strategy that can work, is bringing the hammer and smashing the machines. But of course, in the long run, that's not what we want to do. We want to use the machines and have them help us become wealthier. It's not going to be a viable strategy to simply stop the machines, stop technology, and smash them. Instead, we need to recognize that while the digital technologies continue to improve, the problem is not with the technologies, it's with us. It's with our skills in our organizations, and they need to keep pace. We need to improve them a little bit more rapidly. One thing we can do, especially governments, is think about changing education. Not simply spending more on education, although that would help, but also inventing it in new ways, using things like massive online open courseware, MOOCs, massive online open courseware like MIT's edX program, Coursera, Khan Academy. These are ways of using the technology to spread education to far more people. In fact, I teach a course like this at MIT. It's called Big Data, Making Complex Things Simpler. And the neat thing about this course is while I'm teaching it at MIT, people all over the world can attend, and you can see in this chart, they have their own avatars. It's almost like a video game, and they can not only listen to me and ask me questions, but they can talk to each other, and they can interact with each other. So when I teach this course, every few minutes I stop and I ask them to meet with each other and help do some of the exercises that I teach them and some of the techniques that I teach them, working in small teams with the avatars there. And you can see there's a sort of a seamless integration with me as a live person on the screen, but then the avatars who are in Miami or London or Tokyo interacting with each other. And one of the benefits is that this can replicate some of the best content and decrease average costs. It can also improve measurement. It can give us a better way of seeing what's working and what's not working. We have much more data. When we digitize something, we datafy it. Datafy is a word I just made up to represent the idea that you can measure things with careful data much more accurately once it's online. So let me leave you with one last challenge, and then I want to have some questions, a little bit of time for questions from each of you. The grand challenge going forward for governments and for people in all of society is to understand that digital technologies are going to continue to accelerate and continue to improve. And that should be good news. However, our skills are lagging, our organizations are lagging, our government institutions are lagging. We're not measuring GDP correctly. We're not educating people correctly. We're not organizing our work and our businesses correctly to take advantage. And because of this, the gap is growing larger and larger. And we're having more and more people being left behind. If we simply keep doing the same thing, we're not going to close that gap. So the challenge for all of you is to think of ways that we can reinvent our society and our governments and our economy to keep up with these technologies. The same government institutions that work today are not going to be the ones that work in 5 and 10 years. Just like 100 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, there was a big change in our institutions. We invented new measurement systems, new education systems, and new government policies. At MIT, we have an initiative to work on this, and any of you who are interested, you can go to this website and get data and papers about this. But let me stop there and just say, I'd like to know what challenges and opportunities you see and what questions and concerns you have. And I think, if I check my clock here, we have just a few minutes, a couple of minutes for some questions and comments. So let me just start right here in the front row. Yes, can we get a microphone?
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation you've done in here. My name is Mohammed Shahal. I'm the CEO of Business Development and Strategy at the Economic Department.
Yes.
Now, long time ago until now, we've got a clear distinction between human being and machines. And
Yes.
we are moving along the line to a singularity. Now, after departing from that singularity, we'll go again to clear distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there any philosophical, moral studies? What will happen to human being after we pass that point, especially when the machine tags into the Higgs fields and getting to know exactly what resources are available in the galaxies and pulling it, and we will be left behind?
Yes. Well, that's a great question, and it's a very important one because you can see where this is all going, where we'll have more and more powerful technologies. And a lot of people ask me this question, and I think that the people who I've talked to, they fall into two main groups. There are the optimists who say, look, Don't worry, things have always worked in the past, and as these technologies become more powerful, all of humanity is going to benefit, and we just don't have to worry about it because these technologies will be used to improve the lives of everybody, and they'll be integrated to them. There's another group that's much more pessimistic who say, no, 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 this time is different. We're going to have a divergence, and the machines will become so powerful we won't be able to control them, and we're going to have potentially many people out of work, poverty, or even in an extreme scenario, the machines take over and don't treat humans very well. And both of them make compelling arguments. And people ask, which side do I fall on? And I have to say, I think they're both wrong. And they both make essentially the same mistake. Both groups and most people, they think, what is going to happen to us? What are the machines going to do? What's going to happen with technology? And I think you have to think about it a different way. We should not ask that question. We should ask, technology is a tool. The machines are tools for us. We now have more powerful tools than ever before, and the tools are becoming ever more powerful. And as our tools become more powerful, it gives us more freedom, more ability to change the world. So the real question is, what do we want to have happen? What do we choose to do with the technologies? And we have to take an active sense of how we want to shape the world, not just in this far future of the singularity, but starting today, we need to recognize that we have the power to use the machines, use the tools to create a society of shared prosperity, or we can create a society of great inequality. We can create a society where many people are starving, or we can create a society very soon where no one is starving in the world. It's not that what's going to happen to us, it's what we choose to do. Now I want to actually, I think I'm about out of time, but I think that's a good time to good point to leave this, because perhaps the most important lesson that I have from studying all of this is to understand that we are the ultimate people who choose what will happen with our society and what our choices are. There is no technological inevitability of inequality. There's no technological inevitability of unemployment. There's no technological inevitability of machines taking over. All of these are choices. And you, here at this government summit, and those of us at MIT, once we understand that we have this power, that we have more powerful tools than ever before, we recognize that we should step up and decide how we want to transform the world. And once we've decided what we want to do with it, we will then be able to do that. So thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to have a chance to share all this research with you.